Hello, this is Dan Pro. Welcome to my rigging channel. We're in part 4 of my advanced deformation tutorial series. In this tutorial I'm going to add the squash and stretch controls for our deformation bones. Now before we get too far into that though, I want to address some deficiencies in this rig that it currently has. Now I mentioned before that this deformation system is being built on these intermediate bones. Now I've been directly rotating those bones and to make everything work properly, but in a final rig those are going to copy the transforms of an FK rig or an IK rig, likely both, and do the switching for those. So I need the deformation bones to work on the locations, rotations, and scales of these intermediate bones. And right now, it is only working on the rotations. If I were to introduce some scaling, you'll notice that this upper bone is not scaling right. The rest of it is. However, we need to fix that. And if I design my FK or IK rig to allow the bone to move its location, it is also not behaving well. I would like that bone to stay in line whenever I move that bone. So I want to address that before we get too much further ahead. Again, it doesn't really matter. I haven't decided on how I'm going to allow scaling or if I'm going to allow the location of that to change in an FK or IK rig, but I want to make sure that this rig is ready in case I do allow that. So we could simply just take this bone, since it's not copying the scale of this properly. I could add a copy scale to it, and I could also have a copy location to it, and that would fix it on this bone. However, there are two bones that share the same parent, so if I were to put the fix on the parent bone, I wouldn't have to fix those bones individually. And in a few minutes, when I add these squash and stretch controls, I'm going to have yet a third bone that's going to share the same parent. So it just makes more sense to fix this issue on the parent bone, and that is the MCH thigh.001. That is part of my socket rig setup, where we've tried to bypass the scaling of the hip bone, so we're not introducing the scaling down. So that bone is set to copy the location and the rotation of the MCH leg socket bone. It is parented to the root, so again it's bypassing, and then we're only getting the transforms that we want to transfer down. So I will just add the copy scale. I don't need the scale from the hip, I want it from here instead. I will select it, shift select the MCH thigh.001, add our copy scale, and then I can just replace the copy location of this with a copy location to copy the location of this bone. And now we fixed it on the two bones that are currently in the rig, and when I add the next bone that's going to be parented to the same parent, that will work as well. So if I scale this up, it's going to scale properly. If I move the location, everything's going to follow along, and of course we already had the rotation working. So now we can forge ahead and add our squash and stretch controls. I'm going to turn off that MCH bone layer just so we have the deformation bones and the intermediate bone set on screen. I will tab into edit mode. First thing I need is a duplicate of the intermediate thigh again. Shift D to duplicate, and then I'm going to hold G, X, and then holding control, I'm going to snap this out. Sometimes you need to be a little further away from the camera to make that snap properly. That's going to snap it out in increments while you hold control. Sometimes it's easier to work out in space like this. With that duplicate, I'm going to duplicate that again, and then W, subdivide. I'm going to get my T panel out here and turn the number of cuts to 2, and that will give me 3 equally spaced bones. By default, these bones will be parented in a connected chain. I want to disconnect them with Alt P. Clear parent or disconnect bone, either will work, and that will allow me to move them individually. I'm going to select the large bone, Shift S, cursor to selected. That will put the cursor between the head and tail position, and now I can snap these other bones into the proper position. I want this one right at the center, Shift S, selection to cursor. I'll put the cursor at the end, and then snap this lower one down there, Shift S, selection to cursor. Now this was basically just a reference bone, so now I can delete that. I will rename this top one to thigh.tweak.001, holding hovering over that name, Control C to copy it, Control V to paste it to the others. It will sequentially number them 002 and 3. Next I will set my parenting up. The lower two bones are going to be directly parented to the intermediate thigh bone, Control P, keep offset, and this one is going to share the same parent as our thigh.001, def thigh.001. So I'll select that and find the name under parent, Control C to copy it, and then I can reselect this and paste that name in. So that is the third bone in the rig that is sharing that same parent that we just fixed. Next I can go to pose mode, and I want to set up some transform locks. This lower bone, the tweak bone, is only going to be a location controller, so I can lock the rotation and the scale. These upper ones will also be location controllers as well as rotation controllers all over, although I only want it to rotate on their local y-axis, so I want to change the rotation mode. With them both selected, Control R, I can set the rotation mode, and I am going to lock X and Z and leave Y open, so I will use XZY Euler. Now I can lock the unneeded channels, X and Z, for both. It's only going to rotate on Y. And for scaling, I'm only going to allow scaling on the X and Z and no Y scaling. That is basically going to be done indirectly with these stretch to constraint. So one final operation is I want to add some custom shapes to these bones. It's going to be a little bit difficult after I add them back. It's going to start becoming confusing. Now I actually generated a Rigify rig just to get the widgets from that rig. So I've got a bunch of bone shapes on this last layer, and then I deleted the rig, and I'm going to use those bone shapes just to save myself some time and headaches. So if I select this bone, go to Bone Properties, and find Custom Shapes, make sure that wireframe is enabled for this. Check that box. I'm going to use WGT shoulder.L, and that is because it looks to me like more like an octahedral bone. It's got a fat end and a thin end. I'm going to copy that name and use that shape for these top two tweak bones, but for the bottom one I'll use a different shape, WGT. I'm going to type thigh, and I'll use the thigh hose end.L as a circular shape, although the size is quite large, so I'm going to scale it down to something more appropriate. And for these I also want to resize them so they are the full length here. So I'm going to scale them to, let's see, 1.5, and that works. Control C to copy it. I can paste that into this one as well. And now finally we are ready to reset them into position. So I will select them, go to edit mode, make sure they're selected, G, X, holding control, and that will snap them back into position there. Now we are ready to set up our constraints. Now the top bone already has a couple of constraints, and to make sure that this doesn't become too confusing, I want to name that. Now the first one is the copy rotation constraint, and that is the roll fix. So I'm actually going to name this to roll fix, just to keep everything straight in my own head. It is configured properly, so I can collapse that. And then it has the damp track constraint, that is making it point in the proper direction. That is also already configured properly. I can collapse that as well. Next I'm going to add a bunch of constraints. Now what I want to have happen is I want the deformation bone to copy the location, the rotation, the scale, and also stretch to this other bone. So I'm just going to add all of these constraints, and then we will reorder them and configure them later. So I'm going to select thigh tweak.001, shift select def thigh.001, shift control C. I want it to copy location, copy rotation, copy scale, and then I want it to stretch to thigh tweak.002. So I will select that and then reselect that bone, shift control C, stretch to. Now I want to reorder these constraints in the proper order so this works properly. I'm going to collapse them. Now I want the roll fix copy rotation at the top, and then I want the damp track moved down the chain so it is second to last, and then stretch to at the bottom. I'm going to name these to tweak location. Alright, now that I have these renamed to tweak location, tweak rotation, and scale, I want to configure them. Now for the copy location constraint, that's copying the tweak location, I can leave this as world space to world space. On the rotation tweak, copy rotation constraint, I want to change this to local space and with offset. Now I already have a copy rotation on here, so the roll fix is copying the world space rotation of this bone, and I want the second copy rotation to be on top of that rotation. If I were to leave this at world space to world space, that would overwrite that while this constraint is in that position. So I want the local space and with offset to be on top of the copy rotation that's already getting the world space rotation. So it's very important to have that set up correctly. I'm going to do the same thing for the scale. I want the local space to local space and with offset. Now I don't have a constraint that's doing the world space, but it is inheriting the local space, or the world space rather, scaling. So I will leave it as that. Then we are damp tracking to the next bone in the chain, and finally stretching to the next bone in the chain. Now by default, we'll have volume preservation set on, and this is personal preference. I usually turn it to none, but I will show you what it looks like. As you stretch this away, you're going to lose volume, and if you get closer, it's going to be fatter. Now, I personally like to have that as none, because then I can just add the squash and stretch directly, whatever I need. I think that the automation kind of looks wonky sometimes, so I prefer to do this manually. It's personal preference. You can do use whichever method that you like. Now the only odd thing right now is all working right. I can change the location as following. If I rotate it, it's going to manipulate that y-axis. If I scale it, it's only going to scale in the X and Z, and of course then it's going to damp track and stretch to the next bone in the chain. However, this bone looks a little bit weird being out here in a space like this. And there's a visual trick that we can use. If I select the def thigh.001, copy the name, Control C, and then go back to the bone properties with the tweak bone, under the custom shapes, you'll see that we have an at field. Now I can have this bone display at another bone without actually changing its transforms. It's purely visual. So if I paste in the name of the deformation bone, notice what happens. Now it looks like it's at that position, but the axes of that bone are actually over here. So again, this is purely visual. It's not actually changing its position, but this feels and acts more like you have direct control over that bone. So I like that feature, and we'll leave that on. Now I know that was a long list of constraints. We have a lot going on. The next bone won't be nearly as bad, but it's going to need a similar set of constraints. So tweak thigh.002, I want to copy a bunch of things to def thigh.002 from that bone. Shift Control C. I need to copy the location, the rotation, the scale, and then I need it to stretch to tweak thigh.001. So if I can reselect these, add the stretch to. Now I can configure these. I won't name these just to make it go quicker, and apparently I can't type anyways today. So rotation, or world space to world space, is fine for location. Again, local space to local space with offset for rotation. Local space to local space with offset for scale. And finally, no volume preservation is my preference for stretch to. And we have the squash and stretch set up. So if I move the third tweak bone here, it is stretching to that position. If I move the upper one, I need to enable that visual trick. Control C, go over here at the at field, Control V. If I move the position, move the rotation, scale is working, and we're set. Now that is one bone, and I believe this is the hardest one of this whole set here. So that is the reason that I have done that. It would not be practical for me to go through and do this for all of these deformation bones. So I think that I've given you the tools and the information to get everything set up properly. Make sure that everything is set up where you're copying the proper transforms, you're doing it in the right order, damp tracking properly, and you should be able to figure out your squash and stretch controls on your own. Now, there's a lot of different variables, and again, this is why I can't really practically do this. If you want to use two bones for your shin, you'll want to, yours going to be different. I'm going to use single. You may not want to use my anti-scissoring rig, so that is going to change the way this works. You'll want to keep in mind that we already have this world space copy rotation happening up there, so you need the proper local space to local space and with offsets in the proper order. Now the upper arm is basically going to be the same as the thigh bone, although it is not going to have that roll fix constraint to worry about, but the other things are basically going to be the same. So I think you have the tools, the knowledge, you'll be able to figure this out yourself. Always check to make sure that your scaling is properly working, the rotations, if you change the location, and finally scale the root bone down, make sure everything is scaling properly, roll it around on the rotation, make sure everything is staying relative, and of course location. Make sure nothing is being left behind, so you have a good working rip bone. And in the next tutorial, we will go through a cleanup pass to get everything ready for our first few passes of weight paint. I look forward to that. Until next time, good luck.